You're listening to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast that explores all things theology and therapy. My name is Grace Brown. I'm a registered psychotherapist, certified Canadian counselor, and owner of Journey with Grace Counseling Services.
And I'm Brad Watson, pastor of Nexus Church and author of the book, A Path Called Compelling. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa.
Welcome back to The Sacred Sofa, listeners. Good to see you, Brad, and connect with you again. Here, folks, is where we're diving into deep thoughts and ideas and their real world impact. And so to that end, we've now arrived at the final section of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. And this is exciting. We made it. We've been taking a hard path to learn more about the good and flourishing life. And so why don't you take us, Brad, into Jesus' sermon one final time?
Yeah, thanks, Grace. This has been fun. I've really enjoyed working through this sermon with you as we try to find at least some clues from Jesus about finding and living the good and flourishing life. Now, Jesus ends his sermon here by talking about the importance of foundations. And Grace, boy, did this ever really hit home for me just recently. I bought this past summer, my wife and I, we bought a pergola for the backyard. We needed some shade. It was just too sunny back there. Now, I am a person who believes, Grace, that the fool pays twice. That's a little motto I live by. You buy something cheap, you're going to end up having to buy it again. So I was told by my partner that there was a pergola on sale at Home Depot for $200. And I knew this was a bad idea. No. Can't be getting that. But, I submitted to her desire for the cheap one. So we went, we got it, we assembled it. And to be honest, it provided great shade for us throughout the summer. But we've had a lot of snow here, Grace.
Yes.
A lot of snow. Snowstorms. And the pergola, finally this week, it had so much weight from snow on it, it collapsed. And oh my goodness, I knew it. But when the snowstorms came, it completely collapsed because it wasn't a good pergola. It didn't have a strong foundation, you could say. So, I think it's an apt metaphor, Grace. I've seen it with my own eyes, what Jesus is talking about this week. So at the end of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, he gives this powerful metaphor. Says the wise person builds and constructs their house on the solid rock of Jesus' teaching that we've been going through on the Sermon on the Mount. So when the storms come, that house will stand. It'll be able to withhold. The foolish builder, he says, builds on shifting sand. And so when the storms of life arrives, like my pergola, it collapses. So it's a simple but profound lesson. What we build our lives on determines whether we can withstand life's hardships. So let's start with the obvious, right? The teaching in some ways seems straightforward. Build your life on wisdom, integrity, Jesus' teachings in the Sermon on the Mount. You do that and you'll be prepared for hard times. But what is really striking to me, easy to miss, I think, is that both houses experience storms. So, so often we can think about the good and flourishing life as like, oh, I'll never have any problems, all sunshine and roses. No. Jesus is saying both houses, no matter what you build on, you will experience the storms of life. Neither house is exempt. It comes for both of them. So, Grace, in your work, how do you see this play out? Like, even when people try to do everything right in life, they still face challenges. So what makes the difference, do you find, in whether they can withstand the storms of life?
Love that illustration, Brad, this real life experience of this, which is another reason why I love so much of Jesus' teaching, because it wasn't only philosophical, but it was also practical, right? Jesus fed as well as did miracles.
Yes.
And you know what? There's a practicality in fools, pay twice or whatever the case may be, whether it be a pergola or toilet paper. Buy the cheap toilet paper, but you're going to use more and you're going to pay more.
That's right. Absolutely.
Same with name brand ketchup. Like, you're just going to use more. So
absolutely.
So
boy.
Along with you, at the risk of sounding like doom and gloom, no one is exempt from hardships. And you notice that in the text. Whether you're building on rock, you're building on sand, storms are going to come. And so no one is exempt from hardship. And if you haven't gone through anything yet, just wait. It's
Mm,
a coming,
mm-hmm,
right?
mm-hmm,
This is real life. There is light and shadow in all things, and Jesus is very clear about that.
mm-hmm,
So, what can make the difference? Well, one
mm.
difference is in how someone actually navigates hardship, begins with their beliefs about hardship.
Interesting.
So the beliefs are foundations of what
Mm-hmm,
guides our
mm-hmm,
lives. And so if the belief is that because of your position in life, you shouldn't experience hardship because you've done everything right, or
mm,
even if you're walking the path of faith, including the Jesus path, then you're in for a rude
mm,
awakening
mm-hmm.
because it's your belief about hardship. So you're going to be even more surprised because it's like, I shouldn't be experiencing this. And so that's
Right.
going to be even harder for you to navigate. Not only is everyone is going to experience hardship real because it's real life, but it's not biblical.
Mm-hmm.
Nowhere in scripture does it ever say we won't have
Yeah.
hardships, but God promises to not leave us alone through the
Mm-hmm.
storm.
Mm.
I think the other difference is this, and you've heard me say this, you're going to probably hear me say this 100 times over my
Mm.
lifetime. Safe community. We are created for safe community, and that's the bedrock of our strength and resilience. Joining others in this journey of life. Some of the folks are ahead of us on the path and can give guidance. And then some, we're also going to be a guide for those coming behind us.
Mm.
And that's
Mm-hmm.
incredibly powerful. Incredibly
Yeah.
powerful.
Yeah, I really like that safe community thing, and I just love the idea of walking in the path that other people have walked, and you
Mm-hmm.
know, and we become guides for those who come behind us. You know, another big takeaway from this teaching for me is the idea which Jesus has gone hard on throughout the whole sermon, the idea of inner and outer congruence, right? If our inner
Mm-hmm.
world, our beliefs, values, identity, if that's in conflict with how we actually live, then our foundation is weak, right? It's sort of
Mm,
built on two different things. So I
right.
would imagine that this tension possibly comes up in therapy. Like, how does a lack of congruence between maybe inner value, you know, we say we value honesty,
Mm.
but don't live it out, you know, how does
Mhm.
that affect mental and emotional health?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. The belief systems we have are like an app in the background, but they 100% influence the way we see ourselves and the world around us. And so our beliefs influence what we value, and those lived experiences then form our identity. So if the foundational belief is faulty, the rest is going to crumble, right?
Hmm.
And so, ways to challenge our beliefs is to explore the results. So,
Hmm.
is this belief system actually helping me and others? So, examples of that would be inner peace, joy, satisfaction in relationships. Or is this belief system harming me and others?
Hmm.
Inner and external conflict, discontent, right? Now, here's the thing. We know that left to our own devices, we can rationalize and jump through mental gymnastics to try to make
Hmm.
things fit, but the
Hmm.
results will still speak to the truth,
Right.
right? And community can also create accountability and structure to help us challenge our beliefs as well as provide positive feedback or constructive feedback.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, you know, there's so much going on with this metaphor Jesus leaves us, and what I love about it is there's different layers I think of
Mm-hmm.
meaning here, right? That you
Yes.
can go to, and this is where things get interesting for me because uh, obviously there's very personal applications here, but
Mm-hmm.
it isn't just that. It's deeply historical and societal what Jesus is doing, and in all likelihood Jesus was likely referencing Jewish history.
Mm-hmm.
And these metaphors of storms and floods and foundations, it would be a cue to the people Jesus was talking to
Mm-hmm.
about nations that built on wisdom thrived and those that built on corruption collapsed, often at
Mm-hmm.
the hands of empires like Babylon or Rome. And, you know, we see this pattern even today. Societies built on justice and truth, I think, tend to last, while those built on greed and oppression, maybe not immediately, but they tend to fall apart over time, right? I don't want
Mm-hmm.
to get into the history of empires, but this idea gets me
Mm-hmm.
thinking beyond the immediacy of just my own personal application. So,
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering how this might speak to strong foundations, not just applying to myself personally, but how does it apply to families, communities, relationships? And what happens when the foundation, say, of a relationship or a family dynamic is weak?
Hmm. Yes, I do believe this principle goes applies to families, communities, and relationships, and so on. So because of the passion of inviting people to be in healthy relationships, this is what I do. This is what I
Mm,
do and what I love to do because I'm passionate about guiding and helping and people discover what it means to be in healthy relationship with
mm,
themselves and others. And for
mhm,
some, in healthy relationship with God.
mhm,
There's a spiritual care portion of my practice. And I believe there's a reason why therapy includes a review of family of origin on our past experiences
mhm,
because our family of origin, that's a lot of where our belief systems are created. And
mm,
then those beliefs are reinforced often through confirmation bias by our lived experiences. And so a lot of the foundational work of therapy is going back, at least briefly, to see, okay, what are the thoughts, beliefs that are influencing what's happening right now? And
mhm.
so it's imperative that we do take time to reflect, reduce, and even reject what's faulty in our foundations.
Yeah, and
Mm-hmm.
that's so true, Grace. I found that even in my own life. Like you think maybe you get, me, I'm in my mid 40s. You think maybe you get to a place in life where you're like, okay, I've outgrown a family of origin stuff, but it's still there and it
Mm-hmm.
pops
Yep.
up all the time. These
Mm-hmm.
inherited foundations we receive from parents, siblings, whatever. So it's such a good reminder to be thinking about that.
Mm-hmm.
Something else that stands out to me is Jesus wasn't just warning about bad personal decisions. I think he was warning again in the historical context against two common reactions to external threats. So Jesus people at the time, they were always worried about invading nations, always worried about the next empire that was going to pick on them, enslave them. But if we sort of just think about that as external threats, existential threats beyond us, whether it's a neighboring nation or otherwise.
Mm-hmm.
Two common reactions that he was warning about, which was the first, compromising with those powers in order to gain security. And then the
Mm-hmm.
second one was fighting power with violence. Now, I think what Jesus is alluding to is both of those are foundations of sand. And
Mm-hmm.
what he advocates for is resistance without violence, standing firm without retaliation. And it really hit me this past week because today we see people caught in these same two responses. They're selling out values in order to get security or reacting with aggression, I think. And so
Mm-hmm.
how do you help people when the threat is somewhat external in therapy? How do you help people find a healthier, maybe more stable response to external pressures, whether it's the economy or whatever it is?
Mm-hmm. As you're talking, I just want to say none of this is easy. I just want to
Mm.
go back and
Yeah.
say none of this is easy. Like when we feel threatened, we have some automatic instinctive responses, and those are going to
Mm.
come based on our lived experiences. And so, placating or compromising with the power in power for security, that makes sense.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Or the fight response, right? Fighting with the powers that be in violence in order to, like, these are
Mm.
automatic responses, and
Right.
Jesus knows that. Jesus knows
Mm-hmm.
that. And so it's not easy. When I'm working with folks in the therapeutic space, sometimes people already realize what they're doing or what they've been doing isn't working. Right?
Mm.
What they're doing, it's not creating joy, it's not reducing their anxiety or even creating satisfaction in their lives. Sometimes people come because they're mandated to come,
Right.
which is an even stronger indicator that it's not working and that their actions have legal consequences.
Mm.
So, oftentimes, our work includes what we call psychoeducation, which is providing them information for them to have. So, what is against the law is an example. Other examples of psychoeducation it can be communication skills, conflict resolution skills, emotional intelligence practice, which means being not only self-aware but curious about other people's perspectives. Emotional regulation work is involved. How you feel is a messenger, but it's not the whole story.
Mm.
Another part of the work that we do is validating. It's natural for us to feel fear, anxiety, anger, and other emotions when life feels
Mm.
unstable, uncertain, even threatening. However, the practice is moving back to that foundational belief, which will
Mm.
then take the lead. If the belief is an eye for an eye, right?
Mm.
Or if the belief is the golden or silver rule, these are going to have different responses.
Yeah.
They're also going to invite different results. And the results will determine whether the house is going to stand firm or the house is going to crumble. So there's
Mm.
a lot of work to be done in terms of
Yeah.
shifting mindsets. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and even just your caution there at the beginning about how difficult life is, it just reminded me of how hard all this work is. I
Mm,
remember my first foray into therapy psychology was I was probably only 21 maybe when I read M.
mm,
Scott Peck's book The Road Less Traveled. And I
mm.
remember sitting it down after the first three words, because the first three words of the book is life is hard, and go, oh, okay, I need to sit with that for a bit, because
Right?
life hadn't been that hard for me at that point, right?
Mm,
Like you start getting into it. But I think that's just a very great and
mm-hmm,
compassionate reminder. Hey, we get this. This is all tough, but we're in it together. We're
mm-hmm.
struggling
We're
through it,
in it
trying to
together.
work. Yeah. I think there's also another fascinating connection between this passage and maybe psychological resilience, right? Like
Mm,
the metaphor of a strong foundation reminds me of the importance of mental and emotional
mm-hmm,
grounding and
mm-hmm,
health. And from a therapeutic perspective, what are some ways that we can build on that, build solid foundations in our mental health so that when the storms of life come, loss, stress, crisis, whatever it is, we don't
mm-hmm,
collapse under that pressure?
mm-hmm. Two words, Brad, two words.
Hmm.
Holistic self-care.
Hmm.
Okay. Now, there are different examples of self care wheels. That's one of the tools that I use in my practice. It's called a self care wheel that identify the different parts of ourselves that need regular care and attention.
Hmm.
So, it could be physical realm of our lives, the psychological, emotional, spiritual, professional parts of our lives. We're not separate parts of ourselves, and each of those things are going to touch on each other. And so holistic self-care is an intention on each areas of our lives. We're
Hmm.
creating strategies and building structures to keep our whole self strong.
Hmm.
I like to say self-care is the emotional shock absorbers that keep us from bottoming
Huh.
out when we hit the speed
Right.
bumps on the road of life.
Hmm.
Or using that same metaphor, the airbags when life crashes into us, right?
Hmm.
Because it's a combination often of our choices, right? And the impacts thereof, but things that happen to us that we didn't choose. And so that self-care
Hmm.
is one key way to keep that foundation strong.
Mm. And I'm looking at the wheel now. And I would encourage our listeners to at least Google that. So I'm sure there's different ones, but at least give them a sense there, because just looking at the wheel of self care there, you realize how easy it is to let certain parts slip,
Mm-hmm.
right? So
Mm-hmm.
you might be feeling great emotionally, but professionally things maybe don't feel great, or physically, that time of year you stop going to the gym, whatever it is. There's just
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
keep all of those, it's a bit, there's a juggling act going on here,
Yes.
trying to hold
Yes.
all of those things, and that requires a lot of work, but it's so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you talked about the juggling act, and yes, the idea is to be as satisfied in each of those areas as much as possible. And so it's like that old carnival trick where they're spinning plates,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes, you're spinning all these plates at the same
Mm,
time, and you're not trying to do 10 in each of the areas, right? Like for
right.
some of us, we only have the capacity to one or two in each of those portions of the wheel. And
Mm,
the key is when you're reflecting, are you striving for balance? So if you think about a scale moving from 0 to 10, and 10 is outwards, fully satisfied in each section. If this is a wheel on our vehicle and you got a lot of up and down places, how well is that vehicle going to roll along on the road?
mm,
Right?
mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm,
so the idea is to be creating regular, sustainable strategy in each of those each of those areas so that we can move along more smoothly in the road of life.
yeah, I like that, right? Yeah, you got a flat spot in that wheel, and that's going to be trouble. So one final thought from me on this, I think, is that Jesus, I'm intrigued by this because Jesus is speaking to, if I can just give a little historical context,
Yes,
I won't go
absolutely.
on too far, but Jesus is speaking to a people, and he speaks a lot later in Matthew 24 about the destruction of the temple,
Mm,
what would eventually happen. So Jesus is speaking 40 years out. He's speaking in the year 30, the destruction of Jerusalem, all of that bad stuff would happen in the year 70. So Jesus he can see where this is headed.
mm,
And I think this is really interesting to me because Jesus' message was that collapse of foundation often happens long before the storm
mm.
even arrives. We can notice the cracks in our foundation. I remember having a house inspection, before we bought our house,
Yes, yes.
somebody come in and go, okay, this could be a problem. There's no storm at the moment, but when you inspect the foundation, you go, uh-oh, this could be trouble. And
Mm,
for Jesus was, listen, nations that ignore wisdom, Jesus' wisdom, they don't crumble in an instant. They deteriorate over time. And
mm-hmm,
Jesus was saying all of this, knowing this collapse was coming, but it wouldn't happen for another 40 years. But he could see signs, hey, you're building on a weak foundation. And I
mm-hmm,
wonder if that's the same is true for individuals, families, communities. Mental and emotional breakdowns often result from maybe years of neglecting our inner
mm,
world, our inner
mm-hmm,
foundation. So might there be, Grace, as we kind of wrap this up, what are some early warning signs that
mm.
our foundation or someone's foundation is weak? Like, what should we be looking for before the storm comes and before we reach the breaking point?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Absolutely true. Prevention is better than cure, as they
Right.
say in the old days. Still true today. I want to talk about three main indicators, and
Mm,
I'm sure there are others, but these three can be much easier to spot. So the
okay.
first one is irritability or anger. The second one is low mood, depression, and the
Mm,
third one is extreme fatigue. And let me
mm,
speak to
okay.
each one.
Yeah.
Irritability is actually a level of anger. And when the smallest things start to evoke growing levels of irritability, internal as well as external. So irritability can be, self-criticism is starting to build. External is kind of nitpicking at others. You can't see the good in things and everything becomes a place of frustration. There's a warning sign. There's a
Mm,
warning sign. Anger turned inward can also look like low mood and depression. And
mm,
so we're looking for that as well. And you kind of can ping pong between the two, actually. And
mm,
so when you start stuffing down your discontentment, you're not practicing being assertive with the people in your life and creating healthy boundaries. When you feel yourself starting to shut down and checking out,
mm,
okay, another warning sign.
right.
And finally, this emotional fatigue. This is the type of bone weary tiredness that weighs you down. And no matter how much sleep you get, there's no relief, right?
Mm,
You can't be bothered to care about yourself or anyone else. Warning
mm,
sign, warning sign.
right.
A regular, consistent self care practice can actually keep our lives in balance. We talked about that wheel, the wheel of
Mm-hmm.
life, right? A while back, I took a yoga class. And one of my take, yes, it was good. It was good.
Yeah, no.
It was one of my first too. So
Mm,
there was a lot of learning in that experience. But one of the takeaways I took from that is this concept called counterbalance.
mm,
So she talked about and reminded us that we do a lot of forward bending moves in our lives. We're on our phones, we're hunched
mm,
over our computer, reading a book. Like we do a lot of forward bending things. And part of yoga practice is the counterbalance in terms of backward poses.
mm,
So cobra, baby cobra. Um, what is that doing? It's creating the counterbalance of our spine and shoulders and neck moving forward all the time and creating like yeah, stretch that out and feel the
yeah,
difference. You feel
yeah,
that
yeah.
tension because it's like, what is happening here?
Right.
Right. And that has stuck with me, Brad, not only in terms of
Mm,
my physical body, but in the terms of life. And
mm,
so the holistic self-care that I'm encouraging others and myself with is to create the counterbalance to the stress and stressors that we experience sometimes on a daily basis.
mm,
And so watch for that irritability, anger starting to increase. watch for that dips in terms of the low mood, depression, and that emotional fatigue, because these are some really strong indicators. There's not enough counterbalance to offset the storms of life
Mm,
that are that we tend to walk through in different seasons.
mm. That, that was great, Grace. You caught me there because, as you're talking about, like I'm leaning in, I'm kind of hunched over
Mm-hmm.
talking to you, and boy, did it feel good just to give my back and neck a crack there, right? Just sort of
Mm,
that counterbalance. And, I think that's a great takeaway for all of us, Grace. And I would remind, we're in the season of Lent. This is a
mm-hmm.
great time just to pick up a practice, right? Try it out for a few weeks leading up to Easter and just, hey, maybe this can add something to my day, maybe something that gives us that counterbalance, but an opportunity for us all to think through our own practices. So,
Mm-hmm.
Grace, thank you so much for your insights today, and to our listeners. This brings us to the end of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, and I'm excited we got through it. But it keeps, you know, the final metaphor asks the question of us: what are we building our lives on? When the
Mm-hmm.
storms come, will our foundation hold? If this conversation spoke to you, feel free to share it with someone who needs to hear it. And while we have finished the Sermon on the Mount, our season of pursuing the flourishing life will continue
Mm-hmm.
on for the next two episodes. In fact, we're going to welcome back Karla Drader, our friend and spiritual director. She's going to talk to us about hostility and hospitality. So that's where we're headed next. But
Mm-hmm.
Grace, thank you for your wisdom and insights as we move through Jesus' Sermon on the Mount.
You as well, Brad. I appreciate everything that you bring to this as well. Your insights, your wisdom from the theological perspective. And I just appreciate journeying this season of life with you. Like,
Yeah,
you are
absolutely.
one of my safe people in my community, and I appreciate it very much.
Well, thanks, Grace. The feeling is mutual. So thank you, and we'll see you all next week.
See you next time. Bye for now.